Yes, I thought that before we continue with the interview that we've been doing about my life in the first century, I just wanted to say some basic things. The main problem with a discussion like this is that we're only having a few hours of our time. And obviously condensing somebody's 34 or 35 year life into a 2-hour time period means that you leave out a lot of detail. And so any person who's listening to the interview needs to realise that there is a lot of detail that I've missed out in the discussion with you. So we could talk more thoroughly at another time about the different things that happened from the time of my birth through the time that I became at one with God. But the events that we've described so far have been some of the main events that happened in my life. Of course, there were many other events that happened in my life that formulated my desire for more truth. And it's often the times alone and the times where you spend thinking about things that actually have more impact on your life. So while I've described some of the events that other people have asked about, there are, of course, many other events in my life that impacted upon my life in the first century. And any person who is listening would need to bear that in mind.
Part of what attracts me by some of your explanations is your observations of nature and how it led you to feel the qualities of God. Could you explain some of that?
Yes, well, the way I viewed the universe at a very young age was that it was a playground that God made for me. And I could see that this playground was designed for me to explore. Yep. And I did not have any personal restriction to explore. Yep. I did not restrict myself through the beliefs of my family, for example. And I didn't do just what my friends did, because I felt I wanted to know more about the world than what the average person knew. And so I saw every creation of God as a teaching tool for myself. And I feel I learnt a lot about God's qualities by examining creation. I also learnt a lot about the intricate nature of design. And this helped me understand how intelligent and clever God was. Yep. And then that led me into a further discovery of God's laws. And in discovering God's laws, I discovered a framework in which everything existed. And so after that, I became just as interested in the framework as I did in the creation itself. And through feeling more and more of God's love entering me, this opened up my ability to be able to understand things that others around me did not understand. And that's when I realised the truth that if you seek first God's love, all other things will be added to you. So I found that if I focused my primary intention on receiving God's love, all these questions I had about all these other things would automatically be answered. And this concept fascinated me immensely.
So the opening to divine love reveals the perception of the science?
Yes, there is only a certain amount of science that the mind can understand. But the soul has this infinite ability to understand. And as long as the soul becomes more and more developed in love, the understanding of the soul, or what I used to call soul perception, grew. And as my perception of the universe grew, I came to understand things that normal science could not explain. And so I feel even now that there is a severe limitation on mankind by always trying to use the mind to understand things of the soul. And then in my discussion with spirits that were around me, I learned that there was a limitation of understanding intellectually at the 6th dimension. And I came to understand things that they could not understand. And that is because there is the method of understanding had to do with the soul rather than the mind. And I realised that it was impossible to understand things greater than the 6th dimension without having the soul transformed by God's love. So the soul transformed by God's love expanded and had a greater capacity to understand the universe around it. And once I understood that, I no longer focused on my intellectual development, but rather I focused on my soul development, what was happening inside of my soul. God's love allowed for new understanding to be absorbed by my soul. And then automatically my mind became aware of this new understanding. But if I tried to understand the same thing with my mind, Before my soul had made the transformation, I found I could not understand it at all.
Such a subtle distinction, isn't it? What you lead with.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you lead with the feeling of the soul rather than permitting the mind to lead?
Well, I realized that what God was attempting to teach me was this concept that my mind was not important or as much important as my soul. And once I came to understand that my soul was the only thing that was going to understand God, I understood that I had to widen my ability to feel rather than to think. And that's when I understood some very basic principles of truth. And that's why I said to people in the first century, you cannot enter the kingdom of God unless you become like a little child. A little child experiences the universe around it without intellectually determining things first, but rather the little child allows itself to feel everything until its environment begins to suppress its feelings. And I realized that God had perfectly designed us right from the time of a little child to understand the things of God. But man, in his own self-reliance, used his intellect to suppress the child, which automatically cut him off from understanding the things of God.
So how do we become like that little child?
Well, unfortunately, that is very difficult because we have, unfortunately, placed layers upon this child. And these layers must be deconstructed with our own will. And these layers are layers of addictions, layers of denial, and layers of fear. And once we remove these layers from ourselves, we have the ability to feel what the child feels.
Is the will an aspect of the soul?
Yes, the free will is one of the greatest gifts that God has given our soul. And desire is very much involved with that will. Once we exercise our desire in a specific direction, we will always rapidly create, even if the creations are negative.
How do we distinguish a pure desire versus a desire based on addiction?
Well, Denny, are we now doing an interview about desire or about my first century life?
Ok, nós estamos agora fazendo uma entrevista sobre o desejo, sobre a vida.
Okay, but I'd like an answer to that one someday.
Mas eu gostaria que você respondesse essa questão outra hora.
Well, yes, I feel these are very important questions. And in some ways they are much more important than an interview about my life. But one of the things I did discover during my life was the extreme importance of desire exercised in harmony with love. Once I understood that the framework of God's universe was all to do with loving laws, then I realized that if I exercised my desire in harmony with love all the time, that everything that I desired would be fulfilled. And this gave me a lot of confidence in my life and a huge amount of trust in God.
And this accelerated for you when you began to live alone at 25 approximately?
I suppose you could say that I learned many of these underlying principles when I was very young through the examination of the relationships that were going on around me. But it wasn't until I was later in my life, after 18 years of age, that I started discovering the correlation between the law that governed the action and the action upon the soul itself. So the discovery of these truths was gradual in nature. I had no amazing experience in which then I knew all things. And in fact, I feel and believe that it is impossible to have an instant understanding of something without the soul being involved in a gradual process beforehand. And nowadays I see many people claiming to have an instant inspiration, but in every case I have seen a spirit giving them the information. And so it has not been a personal experience. And I could see that what God was leading me through was a personal experience. And once the experience solidified the truth in my soul, I felt very confident to teach this truth to others.
Shall we move on to the Last Supper?
Podemos passar para a última ceia?
I think that's where we were up to.
We were about there, weren't we?
Acho que foi por aí que a gente parou.
Can you explain to us the significance of the Last Supper and what that represents in your evolution?
Before I answer that question, I feel I need to give some background.
Eu acho que antes de responder essa pergunta, eu preciso falar um pouco do passado, ou um pouco antes dela.
The Bible itself does not portray many of the accurately portray many of the actual events of my life. You must remember it was written through the memory of people, recording their memories many years after the events. And of course it was also their own interpretation of those particular
E é
events.
claro que eu...
For example, the most important person in my life on earth was Mary, Mary, not my mother Mary, but Mary Magdalene, my wife. And yet she was written almost completely out of the Gospel account. And there were two main motivations for this. One was that in some cases, when things were being written, Mary was still alive. And some of my friends sought to protect her by keeping her identity secret. And this caused them to have a desire to leave her out of the account. But the second and bigger influence over the period of history has been the removal of any feminine aspect of religious development. And unfortunately, Mary, by removing Mary from the account of our life, the revisionists greatly distorted my message of truth. They also began to teach that sexual relations were unholy, and this was a very common belief at the time. And in fact, many of my disciples at the time, and now I'm referring to the male disciples, believed that this was my one flaw. And in fact, they felt that my relationship with Mary was my primary flaw. And this was very false. Now, if you come back to the time of what is called the Last Supper, there is great misinterpretations of the event. The Bible demonstrates that, or seems to indicate, that there were no women present. When the reality is, at every event that I ever gave, women were always present. In addition, my relationship with Mary was one of an equal, and I treated Mary as my equal. This meant that, unlike other men, I always had Mary sit with me whenever I did anything. So if I sat in a group and we were having good times together, Mary was always by my side.
Would you share what that feeling is when you are in union in that way?
Well, I see Mary exactly the same as I see myself. We are one soul being expressed in two forms.
Your relationship with Mary at this time was very different than the cultural expressions that existed. So you became an example about how men and women can relate. Can you explain this for us?
With pleasure. I see Mary and myself as one soul. We are one soul being expressed in two different bodies. Of course, the reality is we have more than two different bodies, because Mary has a spiritual body and a physical body, and I do too. But we are these bodies are expressing our soul, and it's our soul. And that being the case, I am not greater than Mary, and Mary is not greater than myself. So in my mind, when somebody invites me to some location, they are already inviting Mary to the same location. There is no separation between myself and Mary. There is no competition between ourselves. And I and she are not greater than the other. So whenever anybody engages our soul, they must expect both of us may be present. In the first century, the male disciples found this very difficult, because they would want to have a discussion with me, but they would not want no women present. And of course, many of them ruled their families with an iron fist, but they could not get me to reject Mary. So for this reason, many times, Mary would be sitting with me while I was having a discussion with only men, because those men refused to invite their wives. However, any event that Mary or myself organised was never preclusive of one gender. And many of the people, both male and female, found this very difficult. Many of the women became jealous of Mary because Mary could be present in what they classified as men's business. And the male disciples were also resentful of me because I refused to engage them unless Mary was present. So if they attempted to organise an event without Mary being present, I would refuse to attend. And they realised that if they were going to have any interaction with me, they were going to have to accept Mary's presence and also accept Mary's contribution. And many of them found this very difficult. But the relationship between myself and Mary is such that we do not see ourselves as competitors in an environment. Any progress I make benefits Mary, and any progress Mary makes benefits myself.
E qualquer
So I want to support anything that Mary does, just as she wants to support anything that I do. And our relationship is even closer than that, because we wish to feel at every single moment the other person's feelings. And we wish to also give to the other person our feelings. And this allows us to be together even when we are physically apart. And this, of course, was very difficult for people in the first century to understand, because the two genders are separated from each other frequently.
So your choice of having her next to you was important for the sharing of feelings?
No, it was not important for the sharing of feelings, because the reality is I can feel Mary's feelings even if she's on the opposite side of the world. However, it is very important for other people to understand that we are one soul expressed in two bodies. And in my heart, she has the same value as I have. And anyone who treats Mary as if she is of lower value than myself does not understand the creation of the soul.
So this applied as an example to both men and women about the equality of the soul.
That's exactly true. We wanted to ensure that we taught the truth by our own example.
So on to the
Last Supper.
Vamos então falar sobre a última ceia.
The so-called Last Supper was just a simple event. Because we had travelled to Jerusalem in order to celebrate the Passover, we just wanted to gather with our friends. Now, there was a lot of external conflict around us, because there were the Jewish priesthood and some of my disciples who were creating this conflict. And I wanted to get everyone together and talk with them about some basic principles of truth, as well as share a meal with them. And so many of them had their wives or partners with them, just as I had my wife Mary with me. So it was not a male-dominated event, and there was no reference, in fact, to anything to do with my blood or body. The later Bible revisionists changed this Last Supper into an instruction that people would then follow as a part of the Christian religion, where people would honour my blood or my body as the sacrifice for their sins. The reality is that I cannot be sacrificed for anyone's sins, and in fact God would never demand such a sacrifice. Also, my blood and my body were just physical elements, and they had no importance in the saving of any person. What was important to save a person's soul was that they began a relationship with God in love. And so in the Last Supper there was no reference at all to my blood or my body, and I established no ritual that the Christian Church subsequently established. In addition, while I knew that Judas was involved in discussions with the Pharisees and that he was attempting to manipulate me into a confrontation, I did not at that time know for sure that he would actually betray me. And so I made no statement to Judas that he would betray me, nor did I make any other statement to any other disciple about the fact. Because Mary was staying at a place outside of Jerusalem, and I believed that the following day would be a very difficult day, because of the conflict between some of my disciples and the Jewish priesthood. We decided together, Mary and myself, that it would be better if she stayed at a different location overnight. So I decided to stay in Jerusalem, and Mary decided to stay a few kilometres away.
Share with us what you consider to be significant from this time period to the crucifixion.
The crucifixion is taken to be a very important event, but it was only important to me for two reasons. It was important to me in the sense that I lost communication with my soulmate Mary by being killed or murdered by somebody. The second reason why it was important to me was that it gave me a vehicle by which I could illustrate the truth that a person was still alive even if their physical body had died. And because I had developed in love, I knew I had the means available to me to demonstrate this in a practical way. Aside from that, the crucifixion to me is a very unfortunate event. I would have preferred to live a long life on earth, teaching divine truth, and eventually getting into having Mary obtain the same condition that I was in. In addition, I would have preferred to continue our life together, illustrating to the world the truths that we were teaching. Of course, I knew that different spirit forces and people on earth would oppose this desire of mine, and I could also see that my primary purpose was to develop the kingdom of God in heaven. But I had very mixed feelings about leaving the earth, because the person that I loved the most still remained on earth, and found it difficult to have a relationship with me after I passed. So my feelings about the crucifixion are very different to the average person's. My feelings are that my life was cut short unnecessarily, because I could have demonstrated the truth of my teachings in other ways. Of course, there are many questions that the Bible account of the crucifixion raises, and I am perfectly happy to answer all the questions about that. But from my personal perspective, the crucifixion did not give anything to the world, and in fact it took away from the world many opportunities that it had.
This is significant, because most religions hold this as important. You're telling us now that that crucifixion was completely unnecessary. It was not a divine plan for you to die in this way.
That's correct. It is not God's plan for anyone to die by being murdered, least of all a person whom God loved dearly and who had received enough of God's love to be at one with him. So the crucifixion was an unnecessary event. It did not give anything to the world, nor did it pay for anyone's sins. It did not allow people to be saved, since salvation is through the reception of divine love from God. It also prevented me from explaining more truth. And this lack of truth on the planet has caused many problems over the last 2,000 years. So while it was apparent to me that I would probably pass early in my life, I could see this was the case not because of some design by God, but rather because of the opposition of evil forces against truth. And evil always fights for its right to remain evil, while truth is always loving and never fights for its right to remain truthful.
Verdade.
And this was a very important principle that I understood early in my life, that I could never defend the truth by fighting for it. I could only present the truth and let whatever happens around me happen.
You did demonstrate how you overcame the illusion of death.
Yes, with any unfortunate event, God has the capacity to turn it into something positive. The one positive thing that was achieved by what happened after my death was that my disciples came to see that what I was speaking of was true. They came to see that there was no such thing as death. And this caused them to let go of many of their fears, and many of them had a much stronger courage to tell the truth to others. And this caused the worldwide spread of divine truth, although it became rapidly distorted through the centuries.
How do you distinguish your presence on earth now from then?
In what way do you mean, Denny?
How do you learn from that event, I guess I'm saying in some way, so that this time you stay alive?
Well, firstly, I am not invested in staying alive. The only reason why I'm here is to share divine truth. I will do that as long as I am able. But if, because of the conflict between truth and error, someone decides to kill me for some reason, I will have done what I can do to further truth on the planet. I do not believe that I will die in this life at the hands of violent people. However, there is still the possibility that they may occur, because every time truth conflicts with error, error usually resorts to violent processes to destroy truth. However, I do feel that there is much protection, because there is a very large number of celestial spirits who are angels in the spirit world who are attempting to protect the divine truth on the earth. And I believe that this force is strong enough to overcome any evil tendencies of others. But this does not mean that I may not die, and I have had to come to terms with that fact.
Is there anything else in this time period that you feel is significant for us to know?
Well, I feel when we look at my first century life and also examine the unheard life of Mary, a person will find that what we taught was far more reasonable and far more logical than what has been presented in the Bible. And once a person understands this process of what happens with the distortion of truth, they'll be more open to examining the truth from these discussions. I do expect in some time in the future that I will be able to discuss with many Christians the truth of the first century life. And we will actually have opportunities to examine the Bible and examine the Bible account of the Bible gospel accounts of my life, and be able to, as a result of that, overcome many of the false conceptions. But to do this, we need to confront one basic understanding that most Christians have. And that is this thought that the Bible itself is God's word rather than the word of men. The reality is that the Bible contains many distortions and also at the same time many truths. You can determine the truth by seeing what facts are loving, and all the things that indicate that God is unloving are also untruthful. I feel that once many Christians accept the fact that the delivery of God's word to earth is a ever-improving process, and the delivery of God's truth to the earth is going to be an infinitely growing process, then instead of blocking themselves to further truth, they will reasonably and logically open themselves to understanding more truth. The main purpose of my coming in the first century was to extend the truth that was available on the planet, and in particular to introduce the truth about the personal relationship that is able to be obtained with God and the effects of the divine love of God upon the human soul. I came to teach what it meant to be born again, not born of a woman again on earth, as in the case that people feel I was speaking of reincarnation, but rather being born again into this relationship with God, a relationship that transforms the human soul into the divine soul that is still human in nature, but also now has a part of God's nature in it. And these are the main teachings I came to teach to the planet. And unfortunately, these are the main teachings that got lost. And once people recognise the simplicity and beauty of those teachings, many people, including atheists, Christians, Muslims, and many others, will desire this personal relationship that transforms their soul. And if myself and Mary are given enough time, we will be able to demonstrate this relationship in practice. And then people will be able to see a living example of the truths that I am teaching. This was the main purpose why we came to earth in the first century. And in the sense that we exercised our desire to teach these particular principles. And the main reason for our return in this century is to demonstrate the truth of these principles to the world, along with demonstrating the truths of these principles to every spirit location. So these are our main goals and desires, and this is what we're looking forward to doing.
Thank you.
I think that's an appropriate place to end our
interview. It's a good place to finish for the moment and continue.
Yes, of course, there are so many more things we could discuss.
É claro que existem muitas outras coisas que poderíamos discutir.
Because there were many events that happened shortly after my death in the first century.
Que ocorreram diversos eventos logo após a minha morte no primeiro século.
That have an impact on people's lives. But I feel in this discussion, we've at least been able to understand a bit more about my and Mary's purpose. And this is really good.
What I heard is the purity of your relationship to God, the simplicity of sharing your love with your wife. It's really quite simple and pure.
And it can be a powerful example to others. That mankind in his infinite wisdom believes that he is far more clever than God's simple desire. And he tries to read into things that are not there.
And hence the illusion of religions.
E aí, por isso que temos as ilusões das religiões.
Yes, this is exactly correct.
Isso está correto.
It's been great having this interview with you, Denny.
Tem sido ótimo ter essa entrevista com você, Denny. Obrigado.
And we'd like to also thank Adriana for translating into Portuguese.
E nós gostaríamos de agradecer a Adriana por estar traduzindo em português.
And we'd also like to thank our photographers who are here present photographing the event.
E gostaríamos de agradecer os nossos fotógrafos que estão presentes aqui fotografando. Tarso.
And Mary.
A Mary.
And we have one observer at the moment, Isabella.
E uma observadora, Isabela. I'd like to thank the possibility of being here and doing this for everybody. Gostaria de agradecer a possibilidade de estar aqui podendo fazer isso para todas as pessoas que estão ouvindo.
Yes. It gives the Portuguese speaking people a way to understand more of the divine truth.
Yes. É uma maneira das pessoas que falam português entender mais sobre a verdade divina.
In future interviews, we shall probably do the interview all in English.
Em futuras entrevistas, provavelmente faremos todo em inglês.
and then have somebody overdub and translate that way.
E depois ter uma pessoa fazer o dubbing e traduzida.
Because this way is quite, it sort of lacks the flow that we normally have.
Porque dessa maneira corta o fluxo da conversa.
Yeah. Thank you very much, guys.
Obrigada.
Obrigado.
Yes.